So now let's do a review of homework exercise number 18, which gives you more practice in finding the missing premise. As the instructions say, in each of the following, discover the implied inference statement or missing premise. You should first compose the argument into formal two-term statements, and then be sure you correctly identify the explicit premise and the conclusion. Look for logical indicators, and then, based on the rules of inference for syllogisms, construct a valid deductive argument which recovers the implied or missing premise. So we start with arguments in natural language, and the first thing we would do then is read that natural language argument and determine which of the statements is the claim statement, and that will become the conclusion in the syllogism, and which of the statements is the evidence statement, and that will become the given premise in the syllogism. So as we look at number one, some of the university trustees are alumni and consequently cannot be expected to welcome cuts in the athletic budget. So as we read this natural language sentence, it's a single sentence, but it has two statements in it, and they are linked by an argument indicator here, consequently. And consequently tells us this second statement will function as the claim in the natural language argument and so become the conclusion in our syllogism. And that means that the other statement here, which is the evidence statement in natural language, becomes the given premise in our syllogism. So our first step is to determine which of the statements is the conclusion, which is the premise, and then translate those statements into standard logical form, placing them in the proper position within the syllogism. So we'll do that here. We'll start with the premise. We have some of the university trustees are alumni. Now that's almost in standard logical form as it is, so we'll recognize that as particular affirmative. Some university trustees are alumni, and then we have the conclusion, which is consequently cannot be expected to welcome cuts in the athletic budget. Well, who cannot be expected? It's the same subject term, some university trustees. So some university trustees, and this appears as a negative, so it's are not, and we'll call them athletic cuts welcomers. And then we look at what we have so far in the syllogism and then apply the rules of inference to generate the missing premise. So we look at this and we have a negative conclusion, which tells us, since we already have an affirmative premise, that the missing premise will be negative. We know that because we must have a negative premise in order to avoid unequal negation. The number of negative premises must equal the number of negative conclusions. Then we look to the middle term, and the middle term here is alumni. We know that because it is not in the conclusion. And alumni here is not distributed because it is predicate of an affirmative statement, which means when it reappears in the missing premise, it must be distributed, because the middle term rule is middle terms must be distributed once and only once. Now I know this is a negative statement, so I know that if I make alumni the predicate term, that it will be distributed, because predicates of negatives are distributed. So I can drop that down here and make alumni the predicate term, and then it would be a distributed term. And so we'll bold that to indicate it's distributed. Then I can turn to the end terms, and the end terms are the two terms we find in the conclusion. And here we have university trustees and athletic cuts welcomers. And trustees already appears twice in the first premise and in the conclusion. And if we look at its place in the conclusion, it is the subject of a particular, so it is not distributed. And likewise, in the first premise, it is the subject of a particular, so it's not distributed. But that's equal, and that's what n terms are supposed to be, equally distributed. And then we look at athletic cuts welcomers, and athletic cuts welcomers in the conclusion is distributed because it's predicate of a negative. And we know this is the missing term because it only appears once. So this will also go into the missing premise. And since I need another distributed term in the missing premise, I know that this is not only negative, but universal negative, because universal negative gives me two distributed terms. So we would have athletic cuts welcomers are alumni. So no athletic cuts welcomers are alumni. Or you could say, of course, by converting that missing premise, no alumni are athletic cuts welcomers. And that would be a logically equivalent term, logically equivalent statement, and also then an equally correct answer. So there's the missing premise for number one. Then we can look at number two. There is no point in studying classical rhetoric, since it is well known that classical rhetoric is a dead discipline. So here we have one sentence, but a natural language argument that has two statements, and the two statements are linked by an argument indicator, in this case the word since. And since tells us that the second statement here is evidence, which will become the premise of the syllogism. That means that the first statement here is the claim of the natural language argument, and that will become the conclusion of the syllogism. And so the next step then is to translate those statements into standard logical form and put them in the proper position in the syllogism. So we can start at the beginning here. There is no point in studying classical rhetoric. So we could say, for instance, all classical rhetoric are, we'll call them disciplines unworthy of study. Okay? This is the conclusion. Then we go to the second statement here, and we recognize that as the premise, since classical rhetoric is a dead discipline. So we could say again, all classical rhetoric are dead disciplines. And we leave room for the missing premise. Now we're prepared to generate that missing premise using the rules of inference. We note that we have an affirmative conclusion, and that tells us that the missing premise must also be affirmative. Then we have the middle term, which we recognize as dead disciplines, because dead disciplines is not in the conclusion, and dead disciplines is not distributed where it appears in that first premise because it is predicate of an affirmative, which means when it reappears, it must be in a distributed position. Since I know the missing premise is affirmative, now I also know it's a universal affirmative, because only with a universal affirmative do I get a distributed term, and that's if I put that term in the subject position. So it would be all dead disciplines are, and then we look at the end terms. Classical rhetoric already appears twice. In the conclusion, it is the subject of a universal, so it is distributed, and in the first premise, it's also subject of a universal, so it's distributed again, and that's fine. Then we look at disciplines unworthy of study. Now, disciplines unworthy of study is obviously also the missing term in the missing premise, since it only appears once. Here, it is not distributed, so when it reappears, it must be not distributed again, because it must be equally distributed. And so that completes our missing premise, disciplines unworthy of study. And so we know this is also going to be distributed because it's subject of a universal, and there we have our valid syllogism completed with the missing premise. Number 3, Jones will never be a success in business, for she is just as concerned about the social impact of her operations as she is about the earnings of her stockholders. Okay? So again, one sentence, but it's a rather complicated sentence, and it is broken up into 2 statements that make up an argument in natural language. So we have this indicator for, and that tells us we're about to get a reason. So this second statement here is the evidence statement, and that's going to become the premise of the syllogism, the given premise of the syllogism. And then that leaves the remaining statement, Jones will never be a success in business. That's the claim of the natural language argument, and it's going to become the conclusion of our syllogism. So again, when we're talking about a statement with an individual representing the category or the term, we know that that's going to be a universal statement. And so when we have Jones will never be a success in business, we know that's going to be, because of the word never, a universal negative statement. So we'll start with that conclusion. No Jones are business successes. Okay? And then we go to this other long statement, and that we know is going to be the premise of the argument. For she is just as concerned about the social impact of her operations as she is about the earnings of her stockholders. Well, that's a very long term. She, we know, refers to Jones again, so there's that term. But this is a very long second term in the 2-term statement, so we'll want to abbreviate that just for the sake of efficiency. So what does the term say? In effect, Jones is socially concerned, right? And so we would say all Jones are socially concerned business people as the given premise, a universal affirmative, for she is, right? So we have an affirmative statement. So all Jones are socially concerned business people, therefore no Jones are business successes. But what's the missing premise? We see that the conclusion is negative, and that tells us the missing premise is also going to be negative. It has to be, because that would help us to avoid unequal negation. Then the middle term is socially concerned business people. And socially concerned business people, which is an abbreviation of people concerned about the social impact of their operations as they are about the earnings of their stockholders. We're just abbreviating that term for the sake of efficiency. But this term, the predicate term here in the first premise, we know is also the middle term. And how do we know that? Because this term does not appear in the conclusion. And this term is not distributed where it appears in the first premise, because it is predicate of an affirmative, which means it must be distributed when it reappears, because middle terms must be distributed once and only once. I know this is negative, so I can make it the predicate term of the missing premise, and then it will be distributed because predicates of negatives are distributed. So we'll put it right in there as the predicate term. Now, we go to the end terms, and we apply the rule of equal distribution to each of the end terms. The term Jones, which already appears twice, is distributed in the first premise because it is the subject of a universal, and it is distributed in the conclusion, again, because it is the subject of a universal. And then we turn to, and that's fine because we have 2 distributed terms. It's equally distributed above and below the line. Then we go to the second end term, business successes. And business successes here is distributed because it is predicate of a negative, which means it must also be distributed in the missing premise. We know then that this is a universal negative because that's the only type of statement that gives us two distributed terms. No business successes are socially concerned business people, right? So both of these terms, business successes and socially concerned business people, would be distributed terms, and now we have a valid syllogism. But again, like with item number 1, if you constructed this with a converted missing premise, that is, if your missing premise says no socially concerned business people are business successes, you've simply substituted a logically equivalent statement for the one that I have, and that's an equally correct answer. So the missing premise here, no business successes are socially concerned business people, and we have a valid syllogism. So number 4, being large and heavy, the official university vehicles must not be very economical to use. So again, we have one sentence, but we have two statements in the natural language argument. And there's something of a clue here, must not be. This tells us this is speculative, which indicates this is probably the conclusion. The official university vehicles must not be very economical to use, and it's based on the evidence that those same vehicles are large and heavy. That's the evidence statement, which becomes the premise in the syllogism. So we want to translate those statements into standard logical form. We'll start with that evidence statement. So what's large and heavy? The university vehicles. It seems like we're talking about all of them and not just a few. So we'll make that a universal statement. All university vehicles are large and heavy. And then we can go to the conclusion. Again, it says university vehicles must not be very economical to use. And that indicates we have a negative. So we'll make this no university vehicles are economical, okay, or economical vehicles. In any case, we have a universal negative conclusion, and we'll mark those terms as both of them distributed. And then we have a universal affirmative statement in which the subject of the universal is distributed. Now we can generate the missing premise. We have a negative conclusion, which means our missing premise must also be negative because the given premise is affirmative. So the missing premise is negative, we know that. Then we turn to the middle term, and the middle term is large and heavy vehicles, right? Large and heavy vehicles is not distributed in the first premise because it's predicate of an affirmative, which means it must be distributed when it reappears in the missing premise. Now, we know that predicates of negatives are distributed, so we can drop this down into the predicate position, and we'll know then that it's going to be distributed if it appears as the predicate of a negative, all right? And it has to be distributed because it's not distributed in the first premise, and middle terms must be distributed once and only once. Then we go to the end term. University vehicles appears twice already. Both times it's distributed, and that's fine. It's equal distribution. And then we have the term economical to use, right? And that's also distributed in the conclusion because it's predicate of a negative, which means it must be distributed again for us to have equal distribution. And that tells us this is a universal negative statement. So we could have actually do this either way. And so for variety, we'll move this back into the subject position because universal negatives are convertible. So no large and heavy vehicles are economical to use, or economical vehicles, and that subject term of a negative also distributed there. So this is the missing premise. It's a valid syllogism. And again, if you had done it the other way, no economical vehicles are large and heavy vehicles, that also is correct because it's a logically equivalent statement. Number 5, we believe in the inherent worth of all human beings and therefore in their inalienable right to privacy. Again, one sentence in natural language, but obviously an argument with a good argument indicator, therefore, and therefore tells us it's this statement that's going to be the conclusion of the syllogism. It's the claim of the natural language argument, which means this first statement is the evidence statement or the premise in the syllogism. So let's start with that premise statement, translate into standard logical form. We believe in the inherent worth of all human beings. So we could say all human beings are people with inherent worth, right? And then we move to the conclusion after the therefore, in their inalienable right to privacy. Whose inalienable right? The same people that we're talking about. All human beings are people with a right to privacy. Okay? And now we're ready to apply the rules of inference. So we look at the syllogism so far and we see we have an affirmative conclusion, and that tells us the missing premise is also going to be affirmative, because if we have a negative premise, we'll end up with the fallacy of unequal negation. You cannot have a negative premise with an affirmative conclusion. And then we look to the middle term, and we know that people with inherent worth is the middle term because it's not in the conclusion. And the middle term here is not distributed because it's predicate of an affirmative, which means when it reappears, it must be distributed to avoid the fallacy of maldistributed middle. And that tells us then that this missing premise is also going to be universal, because I need a universal statement, a universal affirmative statement to give me a distributed term. So that means that people with inherent worth is going to be the subject term of that universal affirmative. All people with inherent worth are, and then of course the remaining term is the term that does not already appear twice from the conclusion. Human beings does appear twice. It is the both times the subject of a universal, so it's distributed twice, and that's fine. People with a right to privacy is the missing term, and I note that in the conclusion it is not distributed because it's predicate of an affirmative. But that's okay, because that's where I'm going to put it in the missing premise also as the predicate of an affirmative. So it's not distributed either place, and that's equal. So here's our missing premise and our valid completed syllogism in standard logical form. All people with inherent worth are people with a right to privacy. Number 6. Clearly, some investors did not know about the oil fields since they sold their stock last month. Here again, one sentence, but two statements in natural language with the argument indicator since. And since tells us this second statement is the evidence statement. It will become the premise in the syllogism. That means this first statement is going to become, is the claim in the natural language and is going to become the conclusion in the syllogism. So let's translate that into standard logical form. We have some investors are not, we'll call them oil field knowers, right? So if that's the conclusion, then I want to move to the premise, the given premise of the syllogism. Since they, which they are we talking about? The same investors. So it's some investors are, we'll call them stock sellers, okay? Some investors are stock sellers, therefore some investors are not oil field knowers. Now, if I look at this syllogism so far, I recognize I have a negative conclusion, and that tells me that missing premise is also going to be negative, and it has to be negative to avoid unequal negation. I then turn to the middle term, which is stock sellers. I know that's the middle term because notice it's not in the conclusion here. And then I can turn to that middle term and note it's also not distributed because it's predicate of an affirmative, right? Which means it must be distributed when it reappears in the missing premise. So I know that negatives have distributed predicate terms, so I'm just going to drop that down into the predicate position here because I know it will be distributed then, right? And then that allows us to follow that middle term rule. Middle terms must be distributed once and only once. Then I look to the end terms. The end terms are the two terms in the conclusion. We have investors, which already appears twice. Investors is not distributed in the conclusion and also not distributed in the first premise. Both times it's subject of a particular, and that's equal. That's what you want for your end terms. But then we look at the other end term, and this is also the missing term in the missing premise, and that's oil field knowers. And I note that it is predicate of a negative in the conclusion, which means it is distributed, and so it has to also be distributed here in the missing premise. And that tells me this missing premise is going to be universal negative because I need two distributed terms. So it's going to be no oil field knowers are stock sellers. Okay? And again, with the universal negative, you could have said no stock sellers are oil field knowers, and that would be correct as well because it would be a logically equivalent statement. So now we move to number 7. There must be some members of the fraternity who are willing to serve as officers. They can't all be lazy. So in this case, we don't have a clear argument indicator, but we do have the must be, and that sometimes tells us that this is a speculative claim or conclusion. So we'll take that first sentence as the statement which functions as the claim in the natural language argument and will become the conclusion in the syllogism. This leaves the second statement, they, meaning the same fraternity members, can't all be lazy, as the evidence statement, which becomes the premise. So now we'll translate those into standard logical form. And if we start with the conclusion, we have some fraternity members are willing to serve as officers, right? So we have the predicate term here is people willing to serve as officers, the subject term fraternity members, right? Particular affirmative statement. And then I add in the premise, and the premise statement is going to be they, meaning the same fraternity members, some fraternity not typing well today. Some fraternity members are not lazy people. Okay. However, one of the things you probably noticed right away is I've created unequal negation. So even though this statement here in natural language seems to be clearly negative, if I translate that into standard logical form as a particular negative, I will create an invalid syllogism. I cannot have a negative premise when I have an affirmative conclusion. But of course, one way around that is to obvert either the premise or the conclusion, so I would have equal negation. So let's obvert the premise statement, and we obvert by changing the quality of the predicate term. Lazy becomes non-lazy, and then changing the quality of the whole statement. So some are not becomes some are. And now we have a particular affirmative statement. And with the particular affirmative premise and a particular affirmative conclusion, I've avoided the fallacy of unequal negation. Now I'm ready to proceed to generate that missing premise. And because I have an affirmative conclusion, I know that missing premise is also going to be affirmative for the same reason that we had to obvert the statement up here. Now, I know it's affirmative, but then let's move to the middle term. The middle term is not in the conclusion, so this non-lazy people is the middle term. And the middle term is not distributed in the first premise because it's predicate of an affirmative. But the middle term rule is middle terms must be distributed once and only once, so this has to be distributed when it reappears. And that tells me that this missing premise is also universal, because a universal affirmative is the only kind of an affirmative that gives me a distributed term in the subject position. So it's all non-lazy people, and then are. Then I can turn to the end terms. Fraternity members also already appears twice. In the conclusion, it's not distributed because it's subject of a particular. And in the first premise, it's not distributed because it's also subject of a particular. And that's equal distribution. That's fine. But then we look to the other term in the end term, the other term in the conclusion, willing to serve as officers, right? And this is not distributed in the conclusion because it's predicate of an affirmative, which means it must not be distributed when it reappears. But of course, I'm going to put it as the predicate of an affirmative again, as the missing term in the missing premise. And that's fine because that gives me a valid syllogism and a missing premise. All non-lazy people are willing to serve. And that's the middle term is distributed there in that missing premise. So there's your valid argument with the missing premise for number 7. Number 8. Certainly, it should be a criminal offense for a newspaper to publish confidential White House computer files concerning the Justice Department. Such publication can only undermine confidence in the president and the American system of government. So we have 2 long sentences here, and it appears in the natural language argument that the first statement is the claim it should be a criminal offense, right? And it's based on the evidence that such publication undermines confidence. Now, we translate these into standard logical form. We'll start with that first statement, which as the claim becomes the conclusion in the syllogism. It should be a criminal offense for newspapers to publish confidential White House computer files concerning the Justice Department. A really long term here. So let's abbreviate and let's make that all publications of confidential files are criminal offenses. And again, if you used a little bit different abbreviation, that's fine as long as we're clear about what those terms represent from the natural language statement. So we take that as our conclusion, and then we go to the evidence statement, which will become the premise. Such publication can only undermine confidence in the president and the American system of government. Well, what's the such publication? We're talking about, again, all publications of confidential files are what? We'll call them confidence underminers, undermining confidence in the president. Okay, so in this case, we have a universal affirmative conclusion and a universal affirmative premise, which tells us the missing premise will also be affirmative, must be affirmative to avoid unequal negation. Then I can look for the middle term, and the middle term is confidence underminers. I know that because it does not appear in the conclusion. And I note that where it appears in the first premise, it is predicate of an affirmative, so it is not distributed. But middle terms must be distributed once and only once. So when it reappears, it must be in a distributed position. So I will move that into the subject position, and now I know this is going to be a universal affirmative because the subjects of universals are distributed. Okay? And then I can go to the end terms, the two terms that are in the conclusion. Publications of confidential files already appears twice. In the conclusion, it is distributed because it's subject of a universal, and it's also distributed in the first premise as the subject of a universal. And that's fine, that's equal distribution. Then I have criminal offenses, which is not distributed in the conclusion because it's predicate of an affirmative, but I know this is also the missing term of the missing premise. So when it reappears, it cannot be in a distributed position, which is great for us because we only have an undistributed position remaining. We'll put it as the predicate of that universal affirmative, and that means it would be in an undistributed position in the missing premise, and that's equal as well. We'll indicate that that middle term is distributed in the missing premise, and there we have our completed valid syllogism with the missing premise. All confidence underminers are criminal offenses. We'll go to number 9. None of the injuries received were self-inflicted, so all of the injuries meet the criteria for disability pay. One sentence, but obviously two statements, and here we have the indicator so, and that tells us that the second statement is going to be the conclusion of the syllogism. It's the claim of the natural language argument. And it's pretty close to being in standard logical form already. At least it's clearly an indication that we have a universal affirmative statement. So let's complete first that conclusion in standard logical form. All injuries are eligible for disability pay. Okay? Then we go back to this premise statement, which is the evidence statement in natural language. None of the injuries received were self-inflicted. And that's none, a universal negative. No injuries are self-inflicted. Okay? So there's our statements translated into standard logical form. But you probably noticed that we've created an invalid syllogism because we now have an affirmative conclusion and a negative premise, and that's the fallacy of unequal negation. So we have to correct for that, and one way to correct by switching a negative to an affirmative or an affirmative to a negative is by obversion. So if we obvert this first premise, right, we first change the quality of the predicate term. So self-inflicted becomes non-self-inflicted, and no becomes all. All injuries are non-self-inflicted, therefore all injuries are eligible for disability pay. And now we're prepared to apply the rules of inference to generate the missing premise. I now have a universal affirmative conclusion and a universal affirmative premise after my obversion. And that means that missing premise is going to also be affirmative. The middle term is non-self-inflicted injuries. It's the term that's not in the conclusion. And it is not distributed here because it's predicate of an affirmative, which means it must be distributed when it reappears. And again, that means it's going to go in the subject position of a universal affirmative. So all non-self-inflicted injuries are injuries eligible for disability pay. Okay? Now in that case then, non-self-inflicted, and I've gone ahead and completed the syllogism maybe prematurely because we didn't test the end terms, but we have injuries here and injuries here, and both of those terms, the end term injuries, they're distributed in the first premise as the subject of a universal and also in the conclusion as subject of the universal. And then the other end term, injuries eligible for disability pay, that's not distributed in the conclusion. And of course, we've already put it in here in the missing premise because it's the missing term, and it's not distributed there either. So we have a valid syllogism with the missing premise. All non-self-inflicted injuries are injuries eligible for disability pay. And finally, number 10. A few of the students didn't study over break since they failed the quiz on the first day back. So here we have one sentence and two statements and a clear indicator, argument indicator since. And since tells us this second statement is the evidence statement, which will become the premise in the syllogism. That leaves the remaining statement as the claim or the statement that becomes the conclusion of the syllogism. So let's translate those into standard logical form. A few of the students didn't study over break. A few is some students are not break studiers. Okay, that's the conclusion. And then we'll put the given premise, since they, and the they is the same students, so it's some students are quiz failures. Okay, so we have a particular affirmative premise and a particular negative conclusion. Now that tells us that the missing premise is going to be negative. And I know that because it's the only way we can avoid the fallacy of unequal negation. Then we can look for the middle term, and the middle term here is quiz failures. We know that's the middle term because it does not appear in the conclusion. Now, quiz failures is not distributed in the first premise because it's predicate of an affirmative, but it must be distributed where it reappears in the missing premise. And again, I know because its predicates of negatives are distributed, I can put it in the predicate position and it will be distributed then, right? Predicates of negatives are distributed. Then I can go to the end terms and I have students, and both times students is the subject of a particular, so it's not distributed at all, and that's fine, equal distribution for an end term. Then I have break studiers. Break studiers is distributed in the conclusion because it's predicate of a negative, which means it must also be distributed here in the missing premise, and that tells me this is universal negative. No break studiers are quiz failures. In other words, no students who studied on the break failed the quiz when they came back after the break. And then it would be distributed in both places, and both terms in a universal negative are distributed. So here's a valid syllogism with the missing premise as the universal negative. And again, if you did a universal negative that said no quiz failures are break studiers, that would be equally correct because you would have a logically equivalent statement, simply the conversion of the answer that I've given here. Okay? So you'll note that you can have different answers than the ones that I've had. You shouldn't have different conclusions. You should always try to get the conclusion correct. But the missing premise, there's usually a couple of options depending on which way you define your terms. So it's possible you will have a different answer than I've given for the missing premise, and you can test that by determining whether your answer is the logical equivalent of the answer that I've given. And you can also apply all of the rules of inference to make sure you have a valid syllogism. So if you have any questions about these items on exercise 18, post them to the discussion board, and let me know if you're interested in more practice with missing premises, and I can provide some additional exercises for you.